Hi everyone, it's Thursday, and so this is the second to last walk that I'm doing for the Spirit Walk. It's I'm missing about 20.8 kilometers to get to my pledged 125, so I know I can do that in 2 days. Today's going to be a bit of a shorter one, but tomorrow I want to go on Mount Royal because that's where for the last day, because that's where we usually do the Spirit Walk. So that'll be a longer walk. I hope that some of you have been finding these videos useful. Again, I've mentioned this before. If you're Indigenous and affected by all these things that I've been talking about, I'm not teaching you anything. Chances are you might be one of the people that I've learned from, and I just always really want to remind people that none of this stuff comes from me, because I feel bad because sometimes people are like, oh my god, Jackie, you're so smart and blah blah blah, and and I'm like, well, I didn't think any of this up. It's just a lot of it is synthesizing, bringing together information, knowledge, wisdom, insights, perspectives that I've that have been shared with me by a lot of different people, and not all scholars. I mean, there are Indigenous scholars for sure who've that I've gained insight from, but I've also gained insight from folks who maybe didn't even finish high school or elementary school, because it has nothing to do with education. And as much as I've always been a nerd, because school for me was an escape and it's someplace I've always felt comfortable, I've grown to see academic knowledge as one form of knowledge among others. And education, formal Western education, isn't the be-all and end-all of knowledge. And to be honest, a lot of the knowledge that I've gained about the injustices in the world, linked with colonialism and capitalism and other forms of oppression, I actually didn't learn them in school. So I've mentioned this before, but there's an Anishinaabe scholar who was speaking at Concordia, I think last year, 2019, during Concordia's First People's Voices or First Voices Festival. And her name was Jean Becker. And she, again, this phrase really struck me. You can get a PhD in Canada without knowing anything about Indigenous people. So this is why, this is some of the stuff where those of you who know me personally know I am in education. I'm a CEGEP teacher, and in the past, when I started teaching 18 years ago. Of course, the first few years, as you know, if you're a teacher, or you're in survival mode, you're just trying to learn how to do your job. And and then within a few years, I started trying to organize stuff around Indigenous awareness. And, you do stuff, you mess up. That goes with the territory. Nothing's ever perfect, and I'm the type to sometimes I go too fast maybe. But I feel there's a certain paralysis that comes with trying to think things through too much. So there's balance there. But in the past few years in particular, I've been working on Indigenous education and going to workshops and doing readings and organizing workshops with Indigenous educators for my colleagues. And this is one of the things that comes up over and over again. It's to kind of de-hierarch. Okay, that's not a word. I was about to try to make up this really awkward word, but I'll abstain from that. And just kind of remove this hierarchy of forms of knowledge. Now, that doesn't mean, because sometimes then there's this other thing, because, if we look more broadly, there's all these as we know, like anti-maskers, anti-vaxxers, anti-intellectualism. It's not saying that, these, that it's all about, everybody's opinion is legit, which I still believe, in having informed things to say. And unfortunately, sometimes people go for the easiest answers on things. But that doesn't mean that somebody with a PhD is smarter and more knowledgeable than people who don't. And, like I was saying, I've gained some really deep insights in my life from people who didn't necessarily have a formal Western education. And and some of those folks were non-Indigenous, but in my experiences in, say, the urban Indigenous community, and also time that I spent doing research and working in Chisasibi on the eastern coast of James Bay in the EU East Sea, or Cree Land territory, some of the most valuable knowledge that I got in my life were from, elders, some of whom had gone to residential school, some of them hadn't finished school, all kinds of experiences there. And it's just, it's taking all voices seriously. So, in our work, we have the Indigenous Decolonization Network that was created a few years back by a bunch of us working in different English language CEGEPs. And, we're trying to kind of spread that awareness among other colleagues and bring as many people into this as possible. And things like, changing our vision of how knowledge is shared, not just from teacher to student, but from, even from student to teacher and student to student. And bringing in some of these Indigenous ways of, sharing knowledge. And, it's something that I talk a lot about in my classes is that I've learned from reading and going to workshops and such is, this whole kind of, like in mainstream Western academia, there's this idea that the stories that Indigenous peoples have been telling for generations, they're quote-unquote just myths, right? And these folks who say this don't seem to be aware of all the rich knowledge that is encoded in these stories. Not just about values, but knowledge about the environment people are in and their history. So there's that. And just also kind of taking each student as a whole person with, having this holistic view of things. And, in terms of the person, but also in terms of subject matter that we teach. Again, there's a tendency in Western academia, and the more advanced you get in your studies, the worse it gets, actually, is this whole silo thing where you're teaching one subject, right? So history or geography or English or math or biology, and that somehow, like, all these things are distinct from each other. And for the most part, in Indigenous worldviews, what I've come to learn is that all these things are connected, and that there are ways to try to integrate these things together. So yeah, I mean, it's been, great kind of delving into this and expanding my own understanding of education. And so there's that whole pedagogical thing. It comes with its challenges because, we've all, those of us in education, we've all been through this self-perpetuating system that prioritizes some forms of knowledge over others. And so it can be it's a big paradigm shift, and you know, we embody certain ways of being in the classroom, and when things get challenging, it's hard to not default back to what we're used to, what we were exposed to when we were students. And one of the challenges that I find too is with the resistance that students often have, especially non-Indigenous students who form the bulk of the student body where I teach, because it's out of their comfort zone sometimes to kind of try to explore different ways of engaging in education, and they want their comfort, or very often they want their comfort, what they're used to, of just, you know, sitting and passively taking notes. And so, you know, but we keep trying to explore ways of doing things that you know, and sometimes it takes some effort, and it takes a lot of humility, because the teacher is giving up their kind of role as the all-powerful being in the classroom, and being open to a bit of uncertainty, being open to discomfort. But it's, at the end of the day, it's very gratifying to engage in this. And there are always some students, we know in the CEGEP system there are students who are there and they don't really know why they're there, especially those of us who teach in social sciences. We know some students are there because their parents are kind of making them go to CEGEP, so they're just taking the thing they think is going to be easy. And when it's not easy, sometimes they're a little bit mad at us. But anyways, there's that resistance too, but there's always going to be some of those. And so, you know, it's just, I try to remember that at this age, sometimes students don't immediately realize the value of what they're doing, and sometimes they do years later. And I always try to remember that. And some of them also, they're absorbing stuff, but they want to be stoic, right? Because they're 18 and they got to be cool. So, you know, but they are taking stuff in, and then sometimes in written responses we get a bit of feedback on that, and we're seeing that they are actually, you know, engaging in their own way. And sometimes you'll never know, and so sometimes I have students only years later who I'll run into or see on social media, and they're like, oh yeah, and you know, they'll tell me a little bit about, you know, how their thinking has changed, and it's like, oh, you know. So, but most students don't reach out. And a lot of people, we go on with our lives, right? And sometimes once in a while we'll remember mentors that we had who helped us along, but not everybody kind of has the desire to reach out and acknowledge that. So sometimes we never know. So, but I still feel like there's value to what we're trying to do. And I guess the last thing I want to say about that is that there's the pedagogical aspect that I've just been talking about, but also in terms of content. So I know not all of you, especially, you know, have necessarily watched all the other videos that I made, but hopefully you're saving the links that I'm sending you in these updates. Because all that material, all that stuff, all these perspectives about the ongoing impacts of colonialism, the history from Indigenous perspectives, the effects of all the different things that have happened with the Indian Act and displacements and land theft and residential schools and 60s scoop, murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirit people, and so much more. The fact that so many non-Indigenous people are unaware of these things is really problematic. And so right now I see a difference from when I started teaching 18 years ago. Now you'll have about half the students in my experience who've at least heard of residential schools. But that is one thing. And sometimes it's presented even in high schools by well-intentioned teachers who, you know, they're trying to do their best, but who don't always, because of their own training, understand how that phenomenon is embedded into a much wider process. As I keep saying to people, residential schools aren't just this blip in an otherwise unblemished Canadian history. They're really entangled with the very creation of this colonial nation. And so people aren't getting that education, and so those of us who are trying to, bring in greater visibility, Well, we have a lot of catching up to do. So, you know, if you have one class and you're with students for one semester, you have to kind of always say, you know, I always say this is the tip of the iceberg, and I want to expose you to different things, and hopefully you'll be motivated to continue lifelong learning on your own. And, you know, providing all these links to the works of Indigenous people that they can then follow. So we have a lot of catching up to do. And then, you know, there's other things involved in education that happen outside the classroom. There's the fact that, for the most part, teachers in the educational system at all levels are predominantly non-Indigenous and predominantly white European descent. So that's something that, you know, we're trying to work on all this stuff in parallel. So there's the curriculum aspect, but then services to Indigenous students, many of whom are in an urban setting when they're used to living in a smaller community. It's not the case for all of them, but some of them. But also at the institutional level, in terms of, you know, getting more Indigenous folks working in the system and as teachers, but also at all other levels of staff, including decision-making positions in management. So these are things that, like, across the country, these are things that are being, you know, advocated for among Indigenous and non-Indigenous people already within the system to try to kind of, you know, often we'll use the term indigenize or decolonize education. I mean, there's only so much you can decolonize a system that's inherently colonial, but we are doing our best to do what we can so that Indigenous students can benefit from this on their own terms and therefore benefit their entire families and communities. So there's a lot more I could say. Obviously, there's a lot out there, but there is stuff if you're interested in education, either because you're an educator or you just value education because you're someone who went through the system, and maybe you have younger folks in your life, either your kids or other people's kids, that are important to you. And you know, they're going through their system or they're going too soon and you care about it. So I'll provide some links in this bulletin today. And yeah, I guess the last thing I wanted to say, just to come full circle, I started by talking about different kinds of knowledge in terms of hiring, and even in terms, not just in terms of teaching, but in terms of hiring. There's also this barrier where only certain kinds of degrees are valued, and sometimes life experience as an Indigenous person, for example, is not valued at the same level. So that's a barrier sometimes. There are a lot of Indigenous people who have degrees, but there are people who would be qualified to teach, but who don't necessarily have the required degree. So that's something else that we're working on. So yeah, education for what it's worth. I acknowledge I'm a bit jaded with Western academia, but it's where I'm working, so I'm trying to do what I can from that privileged position, because I'm really lucky to be there. So I'm trying to do what I can to you know, support these Indigenous initiatives. So see you tomorrow for the very last spirit walk, and then I'll keep you updated if I decide to continue these walk-in rants. All right, bye.